What if Adam was given a second chance instead of the first? Take a moment to think about that as a heavenly fact concealed deep beneath centuries of changed texts, incorrect translations, and purposeful silence, not as a hypothesis or a metaphor. What if the beginning was actually much older, darker, and more chaotic, and the story we were told was only half the truth? The ancient texts refer to these creatures as the sons of God, and they existed long before Adam ever breathed his first breath. Not symbolic children of faith, as some theologians would have us believe. No, these were actual glowing heavenly beings. They weren't earthlings, and they descended not by chance, not in tranquility. They had a reason for coming, and what came next wasn't heavenly order. Rather, it was rebellion disguised as love and chaos wrapped in beauty, when they beheld men's daughters. What started out as longing evolved into something that heaven would never approve of. You have heard tidbits of this tale buried in plain sight, strewn across cultures, and twisted into legend titans, observers, the ones that shine. However, in the Ethiopian Bible, the curtain somewhat lifts to reveal what the Western canon ignores. These sons of God did more than simply show up. They revolutionized the world. They disregarded the directive, and they tainted the planet. Furthermore, a crisis had already started before Eden was even established. The stillness grows louder at this point. Why are these beings already mentioned as though they have existed since the so, called beginning of Genesis? Why does it use statements like there were giants in those days, as if we already know what they mean? What were we not told, or better yet, what did we miss? As Adam was not brought up in a peaceful environment, a cleaning was introduced to him. Imagine a lovely garden indeed, but situated on the outskirts of a globe that is still reverberating with the cries of celestial beings, a world that needed to be restarted because of something else, not because God failed. Adam wasn't a new person. He was heaven's retaliation. Everything is altered by this. If Adam was the second opportunity, then humanity was a rescue effort rather than God's original intention. A restart, a heavenly disruption of something much older and unmanageable. Look at us now, generations later, still unsure of our identity, still struggling with issues of origin, destiny, and identity. It's referred to as spiritual amnesia. Some people simply sense that we have been missiled, that there is an inconsistency, that the stories don't begin in the proper place. The Ethiopian Bible, however, remains unflinching. Others won't tell the narrative, but it does. It describes forbidden partnerships, observers, and a planet that burnt before Eden even opened. It has the courage to pose the questions that call into question everything. Subscribe to the Ethiopian Bible channel and click the bell button if you sense that stirring. If something within you recognizes that this truth isn't just history, but your history, because the following revelations will rock the foundations. I'll end by asking you a question that requires more than just quiet. Do you think that God made his first try with humans, or is it a reaction, something bigger? Let us know in the comments. We're paying attention. When the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, they took them as wives of anyone they wanted. Genesis 6, verse 2, is a single verse that has unsettled academics, unsettled theologians, and been subtly tucked away in innumerable sermons in the West. It isn't poetic. It's not a metaphor. It's surprisingly direct. When divine creatures saw human ladies, They chose to adopt them, not a ceremony, no heavenly approval, only dominance, desire, and a choice that would last forever. However, this aspect of the story is rarely told, not at all. It is skimmed over as if it were a minor issue tucked away between genealogies and flood warnings. However, the burden of a lost world is carried by these few sentences. Genesis 6:214, a planet where the earth and heavens met. A reality that the Western Church views as either a metaphor or worse, a phantom. However, a closer examination reveals that these lines are more than just true. Particularly when viewed through the Ethiopian Bible, they are fundamental. Who were these divine sons then? Why did they transgress divine limits? And what was it about men's daughters that caused them to descend from the sky? You have to remove the sanitized images that we have been exposed to for centuries in order to even begin to comprehend. This was no serene heaven where angels played harps. The early earth was untamed, primordial, and teeming with creatures that were not quite like us. Imagine skies laden with a holy presence, fauna roaming the planet that no textbook would dare name today, and landscapes untouched by human touch. The appearance of the sons of God took place in this environment, not as kind souls, but as strong, luminous, dreadful beings who did more than watch. They took action. They were angels, according to some. However, even that moniker is insufficient to describe them. They are discussed in much greater detail in the old Ethiopian writings. Some of them had fire, like faces. Others had eyes that went beyond time and voices like thunder. They were more than just messengers from God. They were dispatched as watchers to keep an eye on humans. However, something went wrong, or perhaps it was inevitable. They went too far. They did more than only gaze. They took action. They took, and the children born of those couplings were unlike anything the world had ever seen. They are referred to as giants or Nephilim in the Western Bible, however. The descriptions in the Ethiopian scrolls are more frightening and in-depth. These were hybrids, not merely tall humans, ferocious, violent, and uncontrollable. But hold on, why is this even mentioned in Genesis? Why allow such a perilous tale to evade canonization? Because you realize that the entire story of Scripture alters once you see it. Before the deluge, God was not only upset with people, he was reacting to something more ancient. The natural order had been corrupted by something divine, an uprising from above, not from earth. How many sermons have you heard about this, though? How many Bible studies are brave enough to stay here for more than a minute? These verses are either disregarded, ransated, or obscured by theological language in Western traditions. However, the Ethiopian Bible doesn't back down. They are addressed by name. It explains how they descended. It documents their corruption, and it makes us wonder if these sons were indeed angels or something older still. Might they be relics of a vanished world older than the universe itself? A hierarchy of supernatural beings that precedes our conception of angels entirely is suggested by the Book of Enoch, which has been preserved in the Ethiopian canon. Observers, thrones, abilities, some rebellious, some faithful, and those who descended, they were not dispatched. They decided to tumble. Here we are looking into a mystery that most people would never dare to ask, while holding a verse that most people skip. However, you are not here by chance. You know there is more. Which is why you are here, an obscure past, a truth that is prohibited. Continue to observe, because the creatures that resulted from this coupling would create the largest reset in human history, tremble the sky, and discolor the earth. Ethiopia kept the story of God's fallen sons alive while the West suppressed it. The tale was never forgotten by scribes or priests in East Africa's verdant highlands and historic monasteries. Unaffected by church councils that determined which texts should be preserved or colonial doctrine, they protected it like a fire passed down through the ages. The Book of Enoch is one of the oldest and most comprehensive accounts of the story ever written, and it is still preserved in the Ethiopian Bible as sacred truth, rather than myth or apocrypha. Western teachings hardly touch on the depth, beauty, and tragedy of the Watcher story as it unfolds in it. 200 of these supernatural entities, referred to as Watchers, are said to have descended upon earth at a location known as Mount Hermon in the Book of Enoch. They weren't exiled out of fury like Lucifer. They chose to come down, bound by desire rather than punishment. They felt something stirring inside of them after observing humanity from above and witnessing the love that males had for women. It was more than lust. Longing was the feeling, curiosity, the desire to experience what it wrapped in beauty. However, they passed an uncrossable line in their desire. According to the Ethiopian texts, Samjaza was their leader because he was aware of the peril of their decision. He made all 200 of them take an oath before they descended. He was aware that earth would never be the same and that heaven would not pardon them, but they all concurred, not because they were bad. However, they were torn, divided between two worlds, two passions and two ways of being. Not all of them were rebels. They were mourners, lovers, and hope-obsessed idiots. Imagine the heavens opening, not with thunder, but with creatures shrouded in light descending silently. The remembrance of heaven was still shining in their eyes. For the first time, their feet are touching soil. They were not turned away by earth. Indeed, it greeted them. When human women saw them, they were amazed. They were strong, odd and bright, and new creatures, giants indeed, but not only in size, were created out of these pairings. They made a lot of noise, crazy, wonderful, risky, a combination of body and spirit, a race that was neither of the two worlds. However, this was a spiritual rebellion as well as a physical one. The mysteries that had been concealed in the sky were revealed to humanity by the Watchers. They taught the skills of combat, astrology, root cutting, and enchantments. They extracted the wisdom of the stars and turned it into charms and weapons. What started out as love turned into corruption. The Watchers loved something else, too, much, not because they detested God, and that's the heartbreaking part. This was not an obvious good versus evil story. It was a catastrophe. Heavenly creatures who desired to live among us. They desired to develop something new and experience human love. But the earth wasn't prepared for them, and they weren't made for it. The Nephilim, their offspring, turned into monsters not just in looks, but in hunger. They demanded adulation, dominated and devoured. Heaven and earth lost their equilibrium, and the cries of the defenseless made their way to the Most High's throne. What then did heaven do? The Book of Enoch claims that God sent more than a flood. He dispatched the archangels first, Raphael, Gabriel, Uriel, and Michael. They came down to destroy, not to console. Until the day of judgment, the Watchers were captured, imprisoned in subterranean tunnels, and bound. The flood that ensued left their offspring, the Nephilim, to perish. The planet was purified. However, the tale was never completely forgotten, not in Ethiopia. These texts were removed in the West. Councils that were concerned about the implications of the Book of Enoch hushed it, prohibited it, and called it heretical. However, the EA book continued to be considered sacred in Ethiopia. It is still read by priests. Kids still hear it, and everything is altered by that fact, because the origin of evil is a crack in the divine universe itself, not just a result of human sin. If the Watchers were genuine, and their descent occurred, Western theology attempted to obliterate this drama, a supernatural uprising motivated by love, rather than hatred, a fall that was more about intimacy than power, a God who suffers, a heaven that hurts, and a creation that was never intended to support such creatures are all revealed in the Watcher's story. And once you understand that, the deluge appears as more than simply judgment. It appears to be mercy, for there was more than anarchy in what the Watchers let loose. It was Hartach and people. The cost was humanity, not the cause. They were heaven's orphans, not only rebels. The Watchers did not rebel against the Most High by raising a fist in defiance or being cast down like Satan. No, their banishment was more eerie and quiet. It started with a look, a persistent glance at Earth's daughters, and a desire that transformed angelic eyes into restless hearts. These were not shadow-dwelling beasts. They were dazzling, elegant beings who were formed from the very breath of eternity. Nevertheless, something inside of them awoke as they observed humans from above. Curiosity turned to hunger. Desire replaced hunger. Desire turned into choice. The skies understood something had been shattered that would never be completely repaired the instant they made contact with the earth. The Ethiopian Bible's Book of Enoch names these beings Azil, who taught men how to make weapons and women how to adorn themselves with seductive beauty. Barakiel, who revealed the patterns of stars. Kokabil, Erichiel, and Tamiel, each with a unique gift and a sacred piece of celestial knowledge, and Samjaza, the leader, who carried the weight of persuasion. These were not arbitrary beings. They were made to perform higher-level duties, preserve knowledge, and protect divine order. However, upon their descent, they exchanged that order for love, which is even more brittle. The good earth provided, but not the good heaven knew. They nearly seemed to be positioned between worlds, looking ahead to earth, which is teeming with color, rhythm, and life, and back toward heaven, where sanctity and silence predominated. The beauty of where they came from, and the pain of seeking something that will never be theirs, must have been too much to take. It was more than simply a rebellion when the 200 Watchers formed their agreement. It was a submission for a taste of time. They sacrificed eternity. And as soon as their feet touched the ground, they realized they would be banished. However, what is exile if you choose to leave voluntarily rather than being ordered away? They made an effort to love as people do. They constructed houses. They imparted knowledge of mysteries. They had children. However, the conflict between who they were and what they were attempting to become overshadowed every peaceful moment. They were unable to deviate from their innate nature. They were not composed of flesh, but of spirit. Nevertheless, they wrapped it around themselves in the hopes that it would fit. It didn't, and it became evident that the union of heaven and earth had created something volatile as their offspring. The Nephilim developed. something that isn't natural, something that is hungry. But the conflict came before the mayhem. It is reported that some Jaza hesitated a lot. He dreaded the fall of cosmic equilibrium and God's wrath. The others, however, reminded him that their fate was already decided and pushed him on. That moment possesses a tragic nobility, a being who was once enveloped in divine light, now pacing the earth under storm-heavy sky, aware of the cost of his decision, but refusing to give it up, not because of disobedience, but out of affection, a forbidden, impossible, and dangerous love. They weren't devils, the Watchers. They were creatures torn between their desire to feel and their intended identity. That's what makes their narrative both human and horrifying. Who among us hasn't been on the verge of making a choice that seemed like both a blessing and a disaster? Who hasn't made a decision knowing it could destroy them? However, the Watchers did more than forsake heaven. When they chose earth, they upset the rhythm of creation. Light, time, nature, spirit, and flesh were all harmoniously constructed by God. In the song, the Watchers added a foreign note, a disharmony. Their expertise wasn't intended for us. This universe was not intended for their presence. Additionally, the gifts they offered, weapons, enchantments, astrology, and vanity, turned advantages into disadvantages. What started out as love reverberated into devastation. However, there is still a mournful aspect to their story. They weren't just dropped. They shed tears. They saw humanity suffer, heaven become silent, and their offspring become horrible. They also didn't fight when the angels arrived to bind them. They begged. They pleaded with Enoch to speak up for them. However, the verdict was definitive. They are still buried under mountains, shackled in the dark, and waiting for the day when their decisions will be taken into consideration. Not as bad guys, however, as exiles, lovely, lonely, sad, and the world forgot about it. Aside from the scriptures, which Ethiopia never allowed to perish, they weren't tales passed down over campfires. Their body, blood, bone, and spirit were all real. Nephilim, born of betrayal rather than blessing, born of worldly women and divine watchers. They were tall hybrids that were larger than humans. They were the product of a relationship that earth could not bear, but heaven forbade.